there's that saying, if you think you're enlightened, go home, spend some time with family for the weekend or something, right? But the original saying is, if you think you're enlightened, leave 2 hours early for a 30-minute commute. Be stymied by an entire closure of Market Street. Sit in basically a traffic parking lot for 90 minutes while people dressed as Ken and Barbie and Super Mario Kart just lap you, and remember that the last time you were supposed to be here, you didn't put it in your calendar and completely forgot it, and come from a lineage of guilt-prone people, and I did okay. Maybe equanimity, like C minus, maybe. But I'm happy to be here now. Okay. So the Buddha placed anicca at the center of experience. And we said the world trembles in all directions. Anicca is usually rendered as impermanence and connotes two things in that way: the impermanence of people, places, things, that we're all ruled by finitude, and it's all breaking apart. And so on the one hand, there's this level of anicca, the dying is in the being born. And then there's another level of anicca, which is kind of like the micro experience of change being a kind of gateway for understanding, for certain kind of insight pathways. Anicca figures prominently, where we're no longer focused on people, places, things, the anicca of all of this, but focused on the changingness of all phenomena, and in the arising, the passing. And so this is the anicca rendered as impermanence, but also sometimes rendered as uncertainty. And it strikes me kind of a testament to the sort of genius of the tradition that uncertainty was placed at the heart of all things. And now, millennia later, in philosophy and science, math, statistics, it's like uncertainty is central. In epistemology, the philosophy of knowledge, how we know, uncertainty is there. In all of our statistical understanding, uncertainty is there. In the understanding of our brain basically coping with uncertainty moment by moment, doing what it can to reduce uncertainty, to not be startled. And so this kind of desperate tussle with what the Buddha highlighted. In moral philosophy, we all have our views about what's right. We may not adhere to them all the time, but we have our views about what's right. We have to have our views about what's right. And yet, how do we essentially hedge against moral uncertainty? How do we hedge against the permanent possibility of being wrong, not merely about this or that, but about goodness itself, about what goodness entails. So this is Toby Ord, his colleagues, Will McCaskill. In a book on moral uncertainty, every generation in the past has committed tremendous moral wrongs on the basis of false moral views. Moral atrocities were, of course, driven in part by the self-interest of those in power, but they were also enabled and strengthened by the common sense moral views of society at the time about what groups were worthy of moral concern. Given this dismal track record, it would be extremely surprising if we were the first generation in human history to have even broadly the correct moral worldview. It's of paramount importance, therefore, to figure out which actions society takes as commonsensically permissible today we should really think of as barbaric. We think, and they go on to conclude, we think, therefore, that considerations of moral uncertainty and the value of moral information should lead us to conclude that further research is one of the most important moral priorities of our time. Ideally, one day we'll have resolved the deep moral questions that we face, and we'll feel confident that we have found moral truth. In the meantime, however, we need to do the best we can, given our uncertainty. So what's a kind of wise relationship to this? What's a wise relationship to uncertainty? Bertrand Russell said, the whole problem of the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, but wiser people are so full of doubts. The Buddha said that one of the well springs of our suffering is attachment to views, which is attachment to views. And it strikes me that in some way our attachment to views are a kind of defense against anicca, defense against uncertainty and nuance. And the safety of the known, the safety of our categories, our moral certainties and self-righteousness, so all aided and abetted by a kind of clinging to view. And this plays out in small personal ways and in global ways, in our politics, in our judicial system, the Supreme Court, of just starting with a conclusion and then rationalizing your way to it, seeking confirmatory evidence after the conclusion's reached. And certainty is it's a very dangerous kind of state. Certainty is a kind of, it's almost like a gateway drug for the other kilesas, for the other forces of suffering, greed, hate, delusion. And so much of the harm we do, so much of the harm we cause to ourselves and to others, a function of a certain kind of certainty. We don't tend to cause so much harm from the perspective of nuance. And so all of this clinging is very kind of understandable, because as an animal, anicca feels like risk. Anicca, the sense of not knowing, it feels exactly like risk. And information is sometimes defined as a kind of like the reduction of uncertainty. Information is the reduction of uncertainty. I hear a sound, I don't know what it is, I look over to see, oh, it's a person or an animal or whatever, right? There's information, there's a reduction of uncertainty. And there's a kind of prominent model of our brain where our brain is our brain function revolves around kind of desperate efforts to reduce uncertainty moment by moment. The kind of brain is an uncertainty management machine, or the brain is a prediction machine, trying to guess what the trajectory of this moment is. If I can discern that, I can navigate, I don't have to be surprised, startled by the next moment. So I keep compulsive sense of orientation. What is this? Where does it point? What's the vector of this moment? And often clinging to view is a way we try to navigate uncertainty. So we rely, we could say, on the past, on karma as a way of understanding what's next. But that is not the way of Dharma, exactly. Secret of life, Oscar Wilde says, is to appreciate the pleasure of being terribly, terribly deceived. Yeah, the pleasure of being terribly deceived. And on the Dharma path, we come to love our mistakes, not merely to be unashamed by them, but actually to delight, to revel in them, our mistakes. And it is, if you can kind of get over the egoic blow, and the defensiveness of it, it is exhilarating in the way that Wilde suggests, to discover one's wrongness, to find out that we've been deceived, to step out of self-deception. The lot of the Dharma path is the path of stepping out of self-deception, the kind of moral pieties and self-serving autobiographical tales with which we've kind of hummed ourselves to sleep forever, and the traffic's still in me a little bit. So when you come to love yourself, like really deeply, not loving yourself for some reason, just loving yourself, are the mechanisms of self-deception. It's no longer a cause for shame, but actual kind of exhilaration. And so delusion is described in different ways. Here I'm kind of talking about it as clinging, attachment to view, or delusion as being a function of clinging to view. The clinging like seals in some delusion. Some teachers talk about delusion as merely just being lost in thought, the kind of the moment when the bubble of discursive thinking collapses and you realize you've been, in a different world, not at IMC, and it was deluded to be focused on to be living in the world defined by your thought. But it's non-delusion to wake up to, okay, this moment, just being here. And so that's one way delusion is described. Another is there's the kind of deluded type, the greed, hate, and delusion types. Some researchers say, even at the level of a single-celled organism, behavior must necessarily fall into one of three possible categories: move towards, approach, move away, withdraw, or neither, no response. These three basic options cannot be reduced further and therefore would seem to represent the most parsimonious description of behavioral tendencies. Approach, withdraw, no response. Greed is approach, aversion, withdrawal. Delusion, no response, right? And so from this perspective, greed and aversion or hatred are very strong motivational states. Strong motivational states. We know exactly what we want. We know exactly what we want to go away. Delusion is characterized by the absence of a strong motivational stance. And the kind of lack of awareness of pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, in some ways is a blessing, but also because it actually is, it's sort of like some kind of relative of equanimity where we feel less compelled by, a sense of urgency moment by moment. But it's also associated with troublemaking decisions, kind of manifests as indecisiveness. We don't know what to listen to inside of ourselves. It's kind of all noise, no signal. Another kind of way of understanding delusion is that there's a kind of more pervasive sense of it, which is something closer to ignorance, avidya. And ignorance is generally said to be about not understanding the Four Noble Truths, that there is suffering, that there is a cause, that there is an end, that there is a path. But I would say more generally, ignorance, I associate with ignorance of like just losing the plot. Losing the plot. Very easy to lose the plot in a human life. Very easy. As maybe our default position is we're losing the plot. We've taken our eyes off what actually matters. So here delusion is a kind of basic state of confusion, of bewilderment. And so greed feels like a kind of bottomless hunger, the hole in the heart that one's desperately trying to fill. And aversion is the heart's just on fire. It's likened to a cauldron, water boiling over, right? Greed, the hole, aversion, the fire, and delusion, what does that feel like? The delusion feels exactly like the truth. We don't differentiate our delusion from our wisdom. If we could do that, we would no longer be deluded. We would put it down, right? But we live in this kind of strange way, basically in a kind of, Catherine Schultz says, we live in almost a state of assuming omniscience, a kind of pervasive all-knowing, because we don't know what we don't know, and the Dharma path is very much about unknown unknowns, unknown unknowns, not known unknowns, unknown unknowns. And so we talk a lot about the kind of epidemic of self-doubt, but from a psychological perspective, overconfidence is a far more pernicious actor on this global stage. One researcher called it the mother of all psychological biases, overconfidence, And so, how do we live with the permanent possibility of being wrong? This entails a kind of a commitment to live life as a kind of continuous feedback loop where we we are taking in, we are relying on the kind of the things and the people and the problems we run into in our life as a way of illuminating that which we do not understand yet. And sometimes it's only in the collisions that happen, with others that we can begin to understand the ways in which the provincial qualities of our view, the places where our delusion lurks, because it's so unnoticed in our life, and yet it will have impacts on others. We will misconstrue others. We will fail to understand, to anticipate, to predict, and it will cause problems. And so we stay open to the kind of surprises and the ways in which our delusion manifests. We stay open with humility to this kind of feedback loop that is life, giving, receiving, growing. And there are limits to our knowing. There will always be more to know. And as a kind of image of this, I saw this astronomical thing where it's like, they're right, but it's a good metaphor. It's like we can currently see a sphere around us extending 46 billion light years in all directions. It's known as the observable universe. Light from galaxies beyond this sphere hasn't yet had time to reach us. On our leading cosmological theory, the rate at which new galaxies will become visible will decline, and those currently more than 63 billion light years away will never become visible from Earth. We could call this region, the region within this distance, as the eventually observable universe. Accelerating expansion also puts a limit on what we can ever affect. If today you shine a ray of light into space, it could reach any galaxy that's currently less than 16 billion light years away. But galaxies further than this are being pulled away so quickly that neither light nor anything else we might send could ever affect them. I found that kind of beautiful, that like the eventually observable universe, and then there's something beyond that, that like will forever be out of our reach. And that is a little how delusion feels to me, So there's a kind of classic experiment where people were given identical pairs of, this is many years ago, given identical pairs of clothing and asked to pick out their favorite. And people would do it. They would say, well, this one is, I like this one better, the fabric's softer or whatever. And sometimes there's kind of a model of confabulation, usually in the context of neurological disease, but where we give rationales and reasons for having done something, but they're completely untethered to the actual causes of why we did what we did. And yet we believe it. We're not lying. We're not lying and saying like, oh, well, I just put that there because I thought it would, need it for later. No. It's like we just make it up. It's confabulated, right? And sometimes it's called honest lying. There's no intentional sense of deception or anything, and yet we concoct, fabricate rationales for why we did what we did, why we believe what we believe. And from a Buddhist perspective, confabulation is not merely confined to neurodegenerative disease. It is our way of life in a deep sense, confabulating. And a lot of what we are doing is essentially kind of rationalizing our defilements, the kilesas, making them look dignified. And our mind is very, very slippery, and many of our, it's like many of our habits and the reasons we give for our lives are often fundamentally different from the causes. And reasons are the best we can do. We can't perceive causality exactly in this way. We just do our best to narrate it, to understand it. And all we have at some level is what is conscious, even though there's a billion things happening beneath the radar of consciousness, right? And so, in a way, we've become too satisfied with the stories we tell about ourselves, the whys of our life, why I did this, why I believe that, why I want this, why we feel the way we do. And so part of delusion is about becoming more and more sensitive to the ways in which we confabulate and we pull a kind of fast one on ourselves. Yeah, the ways in which we lull ourselves into our kind of, pious certainties. And so we have to, we develop some measure of courage for that, because it's actually kind of humiliating to see how easy it is to pull a fast one on ourselves. How easy it is. And so we're getting very sensitive to the kind of subtle movements of our mind. How do we begin to perceive that which we do not yet perceive? And so part of how we begin to uproot delusion is we become radically accepting. At the cognitive level, we befriend all of the dukkha in us. We befriend all of the kind of our quirkiness and defilements. We actually no longer try to sanitize them as something else. It's not blaming ourselves morally for it. It's not this kind of, this moralism about our inner life. There's a kind of innocence that animates even our greed, hate, and delusion. We want to really actually feel our way into that. Otherwise, it becomes a kind of object of shame. It becomes something like a testament about some defect at the core of our being. And that will lead to many distortions of view. Requires us to rationalize in order to keep a sense of dignity. But the invitation is actually to befriend all of the kind of, all of the grizzled bits in our kind of heart. Otherwise we become ashamed, and when we're ashamed, we hide. We want to get sensitive to our body when we kind of lose our bodily awareness and become embedded in narrative. When our words, our thoughts, our language, when that starts to get kind of like a more and more remote from our embodied experience, this is a sign. And so we start to get more and more sensitive. How do I speak and live in an experience near way, rather than being, as Gill describes, like in those concentric circles of our being. And the outermost, circle is very elaborate mental proliferation and frameworks. We start to I can feel there's some alienation in those words. It's almost like I can't channel my body into those words. They're just They're out in some other orbit. And once we get out into that orbit, we lose contact with this kind of like basic embodied experience. And we can tell ourselves anything when we get out to that orbit, and we'll believe anything. So we have to actually have come back a lot to Vedana, to feeling as the kind of engine of so many of our stories and philosophies and political orientations can be just the exhaust coming off of an unconscious relationship to affect. I don't like how this feels, and we miss that. And then, but out of that friction arises a million things, and you can just live in a kind of prison of one's own delusion, as if that's what matters. To begin to actually clarify delusion, we want to come closer back to the body, to the kind of urgency of affect, of Vedana, as it manifests in the circuits of our body. And so, equanimity, in other words, with greed and aversion, actually reduces the need for delusion to sanitize the first two. And so sometimes I say, like, delusion launders our greed and our hatred. The way that delusion functions is to dignify the other kilesas. And so to launder something is to take what is, take dirty money and make it clean. We do that with our greed and our hatred. Make it look like something dignified. And so if we can have equanimity with the kind of affective currents of greed, of hate, we don't have to kind of build and fabricate, proliferate so egregiously. And so we come to trust the Vedana and are careful not to rationalize the clinging. If we're going to cling, okay, fair enough, but we don't pull a fast one on ourselves by calling it by another name. And so this is on my mind in part because just my own grappling, with the world and the suffering of the world, and what feels very close to my heart in various ways, and the recognition that views are channels into which our greed and hatred flow. Our views and the questions and the issues and the pain points that are most ignite us are, of course, what we care about, but they're also those questions that make the most frictionless channel into which our greed and hatred flows. That's what we tend to notice. We notice that into which our greed and hatred can flow, and we ignore other forms of dukkha. And so King said justice is love in calculation. Love in calculation. But it's very easy to ignore Dr. King. And in those issues where there's no one to hate. There's no way for us to channel some of our defilements, even if those issues are actually of profound moral concern. We tend to just ignore those, and there are many. And so the things that we care about most, on the one hand, we want to protect that care, but the care becomes ensnared with clinging and certainty and delusion and attachment to views, and it becomes a kind of channel for our greed and our hatred. And greed and hatred will not resolve anything in a durable way. And so all of this is it's on my mind in part in a certain way. It kind of culminates in some lines from the always reliable Zadie Smith writing about Israel and Palestine last couple of weeks ago in the New Yorker. She says at the end, "We've arrived at the point at which I must clearly state where I stand," quote, "where I stand on the issue, that is, which particular political settlement should, in my own personal view, occur on the other side of a ceasefire. This is the point wherein, by my stating of a position, you are at once liberated into the simple pleasure of placing me firmly on one side or another, putting me over there with those who lisp or those who don't, with the Ephraimites or with the people of Gilead. Yes, this is the point at which I stake my rhetorical flag in the fantastical, linguistical, conceptual, unreal place, built with words, where rapes are minimized as needs be, and the definition of genocide quibbled over, where the killing of babies is denied and the precision of drones glorified, where histories are reconsidered or rewritten or analogized or simply ignored, and Jew and colonialist are synonymous, and Palestinian and terrorist are synonymous, and language is your accomplice and alibi in all of it. Language euphemized and instrumentalized and abused, put to work for your cause and only for your cause, so that it does exactly and only what you want it to do. Let me make it easy for you. Put me wherever you want. Misguided socialist, toothless humanist, naive novelist, useful idiot, apologist, denier, ally, contrarian, collaborator, traitor, inexcusable coward. It is my view that my personal views have no more weight than an ear of corn in this particular essay. The only thing that has any weight in this particular essay is the dead. Let's just sit for a minute. So offer this for your consideration, and please, as always, pick up whatever is useful. Leave all the rest behind.